Do we understand why Israel is going through the Great Tribulation? I mean, it's their final purge, and at the conclusion of it, they're forgiven and they're pardoned, and they recognize their Messiah, and they're God's priests in the millennium. Okay, let's go back to Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So 3 time periods here. 7 weeks, that's 49 years. 62 weeks is 434 years, and that is a total of 483 years. Yep. 7 weeks, 7 weeks of years, that's 49 years. And then 62 weeks equals 434 years, which is a total of 483 years, which leaves 7 years more. So we see these 490 years divided into 3 increments, and let's consider this. From the commandment to restore Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince. So these 2 time periods mention 7 weeks, 49 years, and 62 weeks, 434 years. That makes a total of 483 years from the commandment to restore Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince. 483 years. Got that? 483 years. Now, the Messiah, the Prince, made his first public appearance as the Anointed One at the Jordan about 26 AD. 26 AD. Now, if you backtrack from 26 AD, if we backtrack 483 years from 26 AD, we come to the king who made the decree in 457 BC. Don't let me lose you on this. If we backtrack from 26, we come to 457 BC. And we come to the king. The Persian king was Artaxerxes, 457 BC. And we are told in Ezra 7:7 that the decree was made the 7th year of Artaxerxes, which according to secular history was 457 BC. Exactly. 457 BC. 457 BC, from the time he gave the commandment to restore Jerusalem to Messiah, was 483 years. Now, King Artaxerxes, he released Ezra and company to return to Jerusalem in Ezra 7:13. But also, this king mentions the wall being restored. And you find that in Ezra 9:9. So in Ezra 9:9, and I'm just reading this to you, Ezra 9:9, for we are bondmen, yet our God hath not forsaken us in our bondage, but hath extended mercy unto us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to give us a reviving, to set up the house of our God, and to repair the desolations thereof, and to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. So this king made the decree, but actually this wall project didn't begin until 444. This was 13 years later, but this king made the decree concerning the restoration of the city. All right, have I lost you on that yet? Um, so from the time that this decree went forth, there were about, I mean, yes, the wall was built in 444, but they were still working and repairing, and it was still restoring things for the next 49 years. And it was a time of trouble. The wall dedication was 444 BC, but there was a lot of things that had to be repaired beyond that because, the whole inside of the city was a mess. Remember who the last prophet was in the Old Testament? Malachi, and basically from the time of Malachi right until the Messiah, it was a time of trouble. But 434 more years of trouble and testing came after Malachi. It was a time of spiritual drought, oppressions by aliens such as the Syrians, the Edomite kings, and Rome, right up until the time of Christ. So there was a lot of trouble leading him right up to the Messiah. Let's continue here, Daniel 9:26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. So there was 49 years, and then another 62 weeks, which was 434 years. Shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. So, these two dates bring us to Messiah the Prince, and then it goes on to say that they're going to cut off the Messiah, not for himself. He's going to be cut off, but not for himself. He's dying for the sins of the world, isn't he? So his crucifixion is right there in Daniel. He's going to be cut off. The Messiah is going to come, and then he'll be cut off. And then the city and the sanctuary are going to be destroyed. When did that happen? 70 AD, right, with Titus. So the city was going to be destroyed again. Daniel is getting, at the time the city was destroyed, at the time of Daniel, there was going to be a restoration, then another destruction, and then there was going to be trouble right up until the very time of the end, which brings us to where we are now. Now, Christ reiterated this in his Olivet Discourse, that the city and sanctuary would be destroyed, and Titus would fulfill that. He was the Roman prince. His father, Vespasian, was the emperor at the time. And after the city was destroyed under Titus, then came the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews to many places, until the 48 generation here. Okay, now the final week, the 70th week, in 927, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, it's 3.5 years, right? He shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Or some translations have the desolator. That would be the Antichrist. So this verse covers a lot of territory right here. But let's first consider the timing of this verse. We're looking at the 70th week. This is the final 7-year period of the prophecy. And for the placement of this 7-year period, we are jumping the whole church age. We're jumping to the end of the age. So we're taking a jump, for almost 2,000 years. And the thing about Scripture is they kind of have their own set of rules. And, if you understand that, it helps you because they don't stick to grammatical protocol. I mean, the Scriptures were written by revelation, they're understood by revelation, but there are certain biblical keys that will help us. Now, I want to give you a little sample of the type of incongruities that you find in Scripture. And there's probably more than what I have here, but number one, the Scripture is not always chronological. In fact, even in, for example, Ezekiel 39 should come before Ezekiel 38. And you find, even in the book of Daniel, you find chapters that are out of sequence. They're not in chronological order. And then passages can be totally out of context. They don't even make sense. They don't even fit into the context. And you wonder, what's this? Here's a passage that doesn't even fit into the context of the verse. Or the verse says, I should say. Then 2, commas can separate centuries. And then also Scriptures can flow back and forth in time with great ease. In one verse, you're in one time period, and then the next verse, you're back in history, or you could be forward in history with great ease, back and forth. And then also, Scripture can have present, future application, or even triple application. For example, the siege of Jerusalem, time of Hezekiah, that's could have double fulfillment. Another siege at the time of Titus, and it could even project into the end of the millennium. There's another siege of Jerusalem, or another coming against Jerusalem anyway. So they could have present, future, triple application. Now we're looking at Daniel 9:26 through 27. And from Daniel 9:26, we jump from the destruction of the city and the sanctuary by Titus to the end of the church age in verse 27. We're making a quantum leap. So how can we justify that? Well, let me give you a good example in Scripture of how one comma can separate 2,000 years. And we're looking at Isaiah 61 and verses 1 through 3. And this is a verse that Christ is going to quote, passage. But in Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 3, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn, to appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. Now, Christ stands up in the synagogue, and he takes the book of Isaiah, and he begins to read this passage. And so, in Luke 4:18 through 19, and he gets to this line, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord And then he closed the book and said, this day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears. Why didn't he finish this passage? He closed the book on a comma. Why didn't he finish that verse? I'm asking a question. Why didn't he finish that verse? He stopped on a comma. To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, and he closed the book, sat down. This day, this scripture is fulfilled. He didn't continue on because the remainder of that verse is not fulfilled until the millennium. And the day of vengeance of our God to comfort all that mourn, to appoint unto them that mourn in Zion. Do you see he stopped on a comma? The rest of that verse is fulfilled 2,000 years down the road. Do you follow what I'm saying here? And this is kind of a picture of what you see here in Daniel 9. This last week is going to take a quantum leap from the time of the destruction, from the time of the recognition of the Messiah and crucifixion, right to the very end. Now I want to say something about this final trial, because this trial that's coming with the Antichrist is going to affect the whole world. However, it's going to directly affect Israel. They take the brunt of it. Do you understand that? It's going to complete their final purge before they meet their nail-scarred Messiah. And I mentioned this already, but I'm going to mention it again, that, we're looking at a 7-year period of time. What happens during the first 3.5 years of this 7-year period? Well, there has to be a temple, there has to be sacrifice. But there's 2 men who come down from heaven who are preaching. And that Israel's on trial by them. Because are they going to receive their message, or are they going to reject them? And we know what they're going to do. As Jesus said, no prophet is accepted. Jerusalem is the city that stones the prophets, and they're going to repeat history again. For the first 3.5 years, they're listening to 2 men preaching that come down from heaven, Moses and Elijah, and they're going to reject them. So they're on trial, the first part. Then the Antichrist kills these 2 men and sets up his abomination, and that begins the great tribulation, the last 3.5 years of that time period. Okay, let's go back to verse 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Now, in the context here, he is the Antichrist. He makes a covenant with many for a 7-year period of time. And what this covenant involves is not clear. There's nothing evident about it, what's involved here. But the wording here, he shall confirm, actually that word means he enforces a covenant with many. And if you want the Hebrew verse or word here, it's 1396, Hebrews H 1396, means to enforce. But what this covenant involves, is not clear. And it almost seems as though if this man is accepted by Israel, then perhaps, at least at the beginning, he's accepted by Israel, then the covenant could actually be a covenant imposed upon certain surrounding nations. It says with many. Maybe it has something to do with the 10 nations that are aligned there. I don't know. But he makes a covenant that he doesn't keep. He breaks it in the middle of that 7-year period. Verse 27, and in the midst of the week, this is 3.5 years into it, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. So several more things to consider here. 3.5 years into this final week, the Antichrist causes the daily sacrifice to cease. And what does that tell you? It tells us that Israel has to go back to sacrifice, right? And as you've probably heard for the past few years, Israel is actually getting ready to rebuild a temple. Where they're going to put it, I don't know. And they're even reinstituting, they're studying the subject of sacrifice. In fact, I've heard that they're getting red heifers, into their corrals because that's part of some of the Levitical sacrifice. So something has to take place there. I mean, last year I was in Israel 3 different times, and something is stirred up there. Something is brewing there. But there has to be a temple. There has to be a sacrifice. And I think that's also clear in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Remember, there has not been a temple since 70 AD. That's 1948 years. Okay, let's take a few other portions of Daniel and also what Jesus taught in his Olivet Discourse concerning this overspreading of abominations. It stems from the defilement of the altar and the sanctuary. Now, in Matthew 24:15, Jesus is talking about an abomination that is coming. Remember, there was one in the past, back at the time of Antiochus. So the Jews knew what that term abomination of desolation meant. But Jesus is talking about something that's coming. And in verse 15, 24:15, Jesus said, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. This is an image that's going to be put into the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. And let's look at another verse here in Daniel 12:11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days, which is in the vicinity of 3.5 years, not quite. Hmm? 1,290, 1290. From the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination set up. So, this is what begins the Great Tribulation. There's going to be an image put into the temple. There has to be a temple, image put into the temple, and then sacrifice is going to cease. And if he repeats what Antiochus did, he'll only offer swine's flesh on the altar. And this is also mentioned again in chapter 11. But this abomination is going to be a repeat of what Antiochus did in the 2nd century. Remember, put an image of himself in the temple and commanded the Jews to worship it. And he also desecrated all the holy things and forbade circumcision, and he greatly oppressed the people, anybody that didn't comply. He forced all the Greek customs on the people. And so the Jews understood this term, the abomination of desolation. But Jesus is talking about something to come, right? When ye shall see this, something that has been, and it's something that shall be. And so this act is going to begin the Great Tribulation. The consummation of this time period, of course, is at the second coming of Christ, and then the desolator is judged. Actually, both the Antichrist and the false prophet are thrown back into hell forever. But again, I just want to make a point here, because the main brunt of this persecution is, in the Holy Land. It's around Jerusalem. And even though Israel is greatly persecuted, the whole world is going to be affected by his tyrannous reign, and tyrannous reign, I should say. And the church is not exempt. He makes war with the saints. So natural Israel is kind of a barometer to the church. When something is taking place in natural Israel, then it tells us, something of major significance takes place there. You always know that something is about to take place in the church. Even in 1948, of course, they became a nation. 1948 began the latter rain, what they called the latter rain revival. 67 war, 6-day war. There was a major move, charismatic movement began in the church, right? 1973, of course, there was the War of Atonement there, and that began an overturning of at least 40 major governments, including our own Watergate. But whenever something is happening in Israel, something major, something is going to happen in the church. And also, of course, God began to deal with things in the church in 1973 too. Okay. It's like the Apostle Paul said, first the natural and then the spiritual. So natural Israel, you see something take place there, you know that something's going to take place in the church. Actually, something's going on there right now. I don't know if it's been in the news too much, but there's quite a buildup there right on the border. And the Philistines are raging there. Has anybody seen any of the demonstrations there? Yeah, it's building up right there now. It's the West Bank that's, the Palestinians are actually Philistines. They're the old Philistine, nation. I've known some good Philistines. We've had friends who were Philistines. They were good men, good people. they want Jerusalem back, and they claim it as their own, but the Philistine nation never had any claims to Jerusalem. The 5 cities of the Philistines were, more on the coast. How they happened to get into Jerusalem to begin with goes right back to the fall when Jerusalem fell, to Babylon. They went in and were squatters. They took over. They never had any claims to that city. But anyway, the main brunt of what's going to take place here is in the Middle East, although the whole world is affected by what takes place. So, we're on the brink here of chapter 10. Should we start chapter 10 or should we hold off? Sure, please, go ahead.
About 2 years ago, they started putting up the images of Alexander the Great. Showing pictures of that.
Yeah. Well, we'll probably cover that some more because I've been in Greece a few times too. And, the whole world recognizes this man. The whole world wonders after the beast that was and is not. Why are they wondering after this guy? It's because they recognize him from the past. They wonder after the beast that was. And how do they recognize him from the past? From an image from the past. Now, in Revelation, it talks about 5 kingdoms that have fallen. This is before John. So that goes right back to Egypt, and then Assyria, then Babylon, Persia, and Greece. 5 nations have fallen, 5 kingdoms have fallen. And the beast comes from one of those 5 kingdoms. But if you look at it this way, if you were to see an image of somebody from Egypt, I was in Cairo last year in the Cairo Museum, and I saw all kinds of figures of King Tut or all these guys. I mean, if I saw somebody that looked like King Tut, I wouldn't say, hey, that looks like King Tut. I wouldn't know him from Adam. And if you went into the Assyrian kingdom, you wouldn't recognize anybody. You wouldn't say, oh, that looks like Ashurbanipal, would you? You wouldn't recognize any of these characters. Or in Babylon, you wouldn't say, oh, that looks like Nabonidus. No. Or Persia, you wouldn't, recognize some image of, say, oh, that looks just like King Cyrus or one of those guys. But when you get to the Greek Empire, there are all kinds of images of Alexander the Great. And huge carved out, it's like in the Dakotas, the president's carved into the side of the mountain there. But there's huge, facial images and statues of this man. That's why he could easily be recognized, whereas these other kingdoms couldn't be. He has to be somebody that is recognized from the past. Right? Any other thoughts? Okay, why don't we just cut off there?